The monitors wouldn't stop beeping. Each sharp mechanical pulse cut through the sterile air like a warning. I couldn't escape a constant reminder that my body was failing faster than anyone had expected. Tubes were threaded into my arms, cold and foreign, delivering fluids and medication while I lay there, barely able to move, barely able to breathe. The doctors had said the infection was aggressive, that the sepsis had spread quicker than they anticipated, and though they tried to keep their voices calm, I could see it in their eyes: concern, urgency, the quiet calculation of risk. I was hovering somewhere between consciousness and collapse, my chest tightening with every shallow breath, my thoughts drifting in and out like fragments of a dream. In that moment, there was only one thing I wanted, something simple, almost instinctive. I wanted my family. I wanted a familiar voice, a reassuring hand, someone to tell me that I wasn't alone, that I was going to be okay. Instead, what I got was laughter. My father laughed. Not the kind of uneasy chuckle people give when they don't know what to say, not the nervous attempt to lighten a heavy situation. No, this was different. It was full, unrestrained, almost amused, as if he had just heard the best joke of his life. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, completely untouched by the reality unfolding in front of him. "Maybe you'll finally become interesting when you die," he said, his voice casual, almost playful, as though he were commenting on the weather. For a second I thought I had misheard him. The words didn't fit the moment, didn't fit the reality of where I was lying in a hospital bed, my body fighting to survive, machines keeping track of every fragile function. But the look on his face told me everything. He meant it. There was no concern, no fear, no love, only a strange, detached amusement that felt colder than the hospital room itself. Those 7 words lodged themselves deep inside me, sharper than any pain my body could produce. "Maybe you'll finally become interesting when you die." They echoed in my mind over and over, replaying with relentless clarity until they drowned out the beeping machines, the hushed voices of the nurses, even the fear that had been gripping me moments before. Something shifted inside me then. At first, it was disbelief, an instinctive refusal to accept what I had just heard. Then came the hurt. Heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest harder than the infection ever could. But beneath it all, something else began to rise, something hotter, sharper. Anger. It burned slowly at first, threading its way through the fear, replacing it piece by piece, until it became the only thing I could feel clearly. In that instant, the contrast was unbearable. On one side, there was me, fragile, vulnerable, caught in a fight I might not win, clinging to life with everything I had. On the other side, there was him, comfortable, detached, entertained. Life and death stood side by side in that room, and instead of reaching out, instead of stepping closer, he chose to stand back and laugh. It was a kind of cruelty that didn't need to shout or strike. It existed in its quiet indifference, in the absence of care where there should have been love. And that was what made it unbearable. Not just what he said, but what it revealed. Because in that moment, it became impossible to ignore the truth I had spent years avoiding. I was not seen, not valued, not loved in the way I had always believed. The words didn't fade. They didn't soften with time or context. They stayed repeating in my mind like a wound that refused to close, each repetition cutting a little deeper, stripping away every illusion I had built around my family. As I lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines that were keeping me alive, I realized something with a clarity I had never felt before. This wasn't just a cruel remark. It was a revelation, a trigger. The moment everything changed. Because somewhere between the fear of dying and the shock of his laughter, I stopped waiting for them to care. And once that happened, there was no going back. Lying there in the hospital bed with the rhythmic beeping of machines filling the silence, I kept replaying his words in my head. Not just as an isolated moment of cruelty, but as something that suddenly made everything else make sense. At first, I tried to resist it. I told myself he didn't mean it, that it was just his way of coping, that people say strange things when they're uncomfortable. I had spent years building these explanations. Small, protective lies I repeated to myself whenever something didn't feel right. But this time they didn't hold. The weight of that sentence, so cold, so deliberate, pressed against every memory I had of my family, forcing me to see them not as separate incidents but as pieces of a pattern I had refused to acknowledge. I thought back to the beginning, to the moment I got my first job. I had been so proud, so hopeful. It felt like I had finally stepped into a life where I could give back, where I could ease the burden for the people who had raised me. When my first paycheck came in, I didn't think twice about helping them. It felt natural, even fulfilling. Paying off a credit card here, covering a bill there, it gave me a sense of purpose, as if I was finally becoming the daughter they deserved. And in those early moments I convinced myself it was love, that this was what family did for each other. But as I lay there, weak and exhausted, the memories began to shift. What once felt like generosity started to look different, sharper, more transactional. It was never just one favor. It was always the next request, the next emergency, the next thing only I could fix. My father's truck needed repairs, of course I paid. My mother wanted to renovate the kitchen, why wouldn't I help? My brother couldn't cover his rent, how could I say no? Each time I told myself it was temporary. That things would stabilize, that they would eventually stand on their own. But they never did. Because they didn't have to. And that was the realization that hit me hardest. They didn't rely on me because they couldn't manage without me. They relied on me because they knew I wouldn't stop, because I had made myself predictable, dependable, available, not as a daughter but as a solution, a safety net, a resource they could tap into whenever things became inconvenient. There were no thank you notes, no real gratitude, no effort to repay or even acknowledge the weight of what I was carrying. Just silence until the next problem appeared, until the next time they needed something. I remembered the times I hesitated, the rare moments when I asked questions or tried to push back. The way their tone would change instantly, how disappointment would turn into guilt, and guilt into pressure. We raised you, they would say. Family takes care of each other. It sounded noble on the surface, but now in the quiet clarity of that hospital room I could hear what was really underneath it. Obligation, control, a subtle reminder that my value came from what I could provide, not who I was. And I had accepted it over and over again because I wanted to believe there was something more behind it, that somewhere beneath the expectations, there was love. But now, stripped of all distraction, all noise, I could finally see it clearly. Love doesn't disappear when things get hard. It doesn't vanish when someone is at their most vulnerable. And it certainly doesn't laugh in the face of someone who might be dying. The truth settled into me slowly but firmly. I had never really been seen as a daughter. Not in the way I had always imagined. I was useful. I was reliable. I was necessary. But only as long as I kept giving. The moment I became a burden instead of a benefit, the illusion shattered. There was a strange kind of calm that followed that realization. Not relief, not yet, but clarity. The kind that comes when something painful finally makes sense. The hope I had been holding on to for years, the quiet belief that if I just did enough, gave enough, loved enough, they would eventually meet me halfway, began to dissolve. In its place was something far less comforting but far more honest. They weren't incapable of loving me, they had simply chosen not to. And I had spent years mistaking their dependence for affection, their expectations for connection. As I stared up at the ceiling, my body still weak but my mind sharper than it had ever been, I understood that this moment wasn't just about what had happened in that room. It was about everything that had led up to it. Every check I had written, every sacrifice I had made, every time I had put their needs before my own. It all pointed to the same truth. I wasn't part of a family. I was sustaining one, and the difference between those two things was something I could no longer ignore. For a long time I told myself there was a good reason for everything I did, that the sacrifices, the constant giving, the quiet exhaustion that followed me from one month to the next, it all meant something. It had to. Otherwise I would have had to admit that I was pouring my life into something that would never give anything back. When I first started earning real money, it felt like stepping into a dream. A stable job in the IT industry. A salary that exceeded anything I had imagined right out of university. It gave me not just independence, but purpose. I remember looking at my bank account for the first time and thinking, finally I can make things easier for them. My parents had always talked about how hard things were, how much they struggled, how every bill felt like a burden. So when I offered to help, it wasn't forced. It came from a place of genuine care. Paying off a credit card here, covering a late utility bill there, it felt like I was doing the right thing, like I was finally giving back for everything they had done for me. But what started as a gesture quickly became an expectation. The first time my father called about his truck needing a costly transmission repair, I didn't hesitate. Of course I would pay. He needed it for work, and without it, things would fall apart. Then came my mother's kitchen renovation. She spoke about it as if it were a necessity, not a luxury, describing outdated cabinets and broken fixtures as though they were urgent problems that needed immediate fixing. I remember signing that check. convincing myself it would make her happy, that maybe she would finally feel proud of me. Then my brother Derek lost his job. He said it was temporary, just a rough patch, and I believed him. I covered his rent for a month, then another, then another. Each time there was always a reason, always a promise that things would get better soon. But they never did, because they didn't have to. The pattern became so normal that I stopped questioning it. Every month a portion of my income disappeared before I even had the chance to think about what I wanted or needed. The mortgage for my parents' house, the car insurance for Derek's truck, half of the utilities for a place I didn't even live in, all of it ran automatically like a system I had built and could no longer shut down. Even their internet and electricity bills were in my name because their credit wasn't strong enough to pass the checks. At the time, I saw it as helping them stay afloat. Now I see it for what it really was. I had become the foundation they stood on, whether I realized it or not. What made it harder to see was the absence of confrontation. They didn't demand things outright. They didn't need to. Instead, they relied on something far more effective: silence and implication. There were no thank you cards, no heartfelt conversations acknowledging what I was doing for them. Just a quiet assumption that I would be there, that I would handle it, that I would fix whatever problem came next. And when I hesitated even slightly, the atmosphere would shift. My father's voice would grow colder, my mother would sigh in disappointment, and Derek would remind me in his own careless way that family is supposed to support each other. It was never framed as a choice, it was framed as an obligation. I remember one specific evening sitting alone in my apartment staring at my bank statement. I had just paid off another round of expenses, repairs, bills, overdue balances, and what was left for me felt almost insignificant. I had worked all month long, hours, stressful deadlines, constant pressure, and yet somehow the results of that effort belonged to everyone but me. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, once Derek found a job, once my parents got back on their feet, everything would balance out. But deep down there was a quiet voice asking a question I didn't want to answer: what if this never ends? Looking back, the answer was obvious. It didn't end because I never allowed it to. Every time I stepped in, every time I solved their problems, I removed the need for them to change. Why would they budget better, work harder, or make different choices if I was always there to absorb the consequences? It wasn't just support, it was a system of dependency, one that I had unknowingly reinforced over and over again. And the more I gave, the more it was expected. Until giving wasn't something I did anymore, it was something I was. There were moments, small and fleeting, when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Like when Derek would post pictures from weekend trips to Las Vegas, drinks in hand, smiling as if he didn't have a care in the world while I was covering his rent. Or when my mother talked excitedly about new decorations for a house I was paying for, never once asking how I was managing everything on my end. Or when my father casually mentioned expenses, already assuming I would take care of them before I had even responded. Each of those moments created a crack in the story I had been telling myself, but I always patched it up, always found a way to justify it, because the alternative that I was being used was too painful to accept. What I didn't realize then was how deeply this pattern had shaped my sense of worth. I had begun to measure my value by what I could provide, by how much I could fix, by how indispensable I could make myself. Saying no felt like failure. Setting boundaries felt like betrayal. So I kept going, kept giving, kept convincing myself that this was what love looked like, that this was what family meant. But as the years passed, the imbalance only grew heavier, more suffocating, until it became impossible to ignore the truth: I wasn't supporting my family out of mutual care. I was sustaining them at the cost of myself. And the longer it went on, the clearer it became that this wasn't generosity anymore, it was exploitation wrapped in the language of loyalty and obligation. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, almost hesitantly, like testing the edge of something I wasn't sure I was allowed to touch. After years of saying yes without thinking, I began to pause. The first time I told Derek I couldn't fund one of his business ideas, the words felt foreign in my mouth, heavy and unfamiliar. I expected resistance, maybe frustration, but what I didn't expect was the immediate change in his tone. The casual warmth he usually carried when asking for money disappeared, replaced by irritation that bordered on entitlement. He didn't argue with logic or try to convince me. Instead, he leaned on something else entirely: guilt. "I thought you wanted to see me succeed," he said, his voice edged with disappointment. It was subtle but effective. For a moment I almost caved. That was how it had always worked. But this time I didn't. That single no marked the beginning of something I couldn't undo. It wasn't just about the money, it was about disrupting a pattern they had come to rely on. When I refused to pay for my mother's cosmetic procedure a few weeks later, the reaction was even colder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she withdrew, speaking to me less, her messages becoming shorter, distant, almost formal. When she did speak, it was often through others' relatives who suddenly reached out to remind me how much my mother had sacrificed for me, how selfish it was to deny her something she deserved. It wasn't a direct confrontation, but it carried the same weight, a carefully orchestrated pressure designed to pull me back into place. My father's response was different but no less revealing. He became detached, dismissive in a way that felt more cutting than anger. Conversations with him grew brief, stripped of any warmth they once had. Where he used to call me regularly, usually when something needed fixing, there was now silence. And when he did reach out, it was transactional, as if we were no longer family but strangers negotiating terms. It was in those moments that I began to understand something I had ignored for years. Their closeness to me had never been unconditional. It had always been tied to what I could provide. The more I held my ground, the clearer the pattern became. Their reactions weren't about concern or misunderstanding, they were about control. When the flow of money stopped, so did the illusion of affection. What replaced it was a calculated mix of manipulation and distance designed to make me question myself. They reminded me of everything they had done for me, framed my boundaries as betrayal, and painted my independence as selfishness. Family takes care of each other, they would say. But what they meant was far more one-sided than that. Care in their world flowed in only one direction. There was a moment when I almost gave in again. Late at night, alone in my apartment, I replayed their words in my head, wondering if I had gone too far. If maybe I was being ungrateful, if maybe I owed them more than I was willing to admit. That doubt had been carefully planted, nurtured over years of subtle conditioning. But something was different now. For the first time, I allowed myself to question not my actions but theirs. Why did my value to them seem to shrink the moment I stopped giving? Why did love feel conditional, dependent on my willingness to sacrifice? The answers were uncomfortable but undeniable. Setting boundaries didn't destroy our relationship, it revealed its true nature. The warmth I had once believed in began to look more like convenience. The support I thought was mutual turned out to be expectation. And the closeness I held onto for so long was in reality fragile, easily withdrawn the moment I stepped out of line. It was a painful realization but also a clarifying one, because for the first time I wasn't reacting out of habit or obligation. I was observing, understanding, and slowly reclaiming something I had lost without noticing the right to choose how I was treated. That was the true turning point. Not the arguments, not the cold silence, not even the guilt. It was the moment I recognized that their behavior wasn't a reaction to my change, it was a reflection of who they had always been. And once I saw that clearly, there was no way to unsee it. By the time my condition worsened, there was no more room for denial, no more space to pretend that things were simply complicated or misunderstood. My body was shutting down in ways I could feel but couldn't control, each breath shallow, each movement heavy, as if even existing required more strength than I had left. The doctors spoke in careful tones, using words like monitor closely and critical, but their urgency betrayed the truth. I was no longer just sick, I was in danger. And in the middle of all that fear, all that uncertainty, I reached for the one thing I had always believed would be there for me, my family. I remember gripping my phone with trembling fingers, the screen slightly blurred from the fever that refused to break. It didn't occur to me that they wouldn't come. Not really. Despite everything, despite the growing distance, I still held on to the belief that this moment, this line between life and death would be enough to bring them back to me. That whatever tension had built over the months would dissolve in the face of something real, something serious. I called my father first. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I told myself he must be busy, that he would call back. I tried my mother next. No answer. Then Derek. He picked up his voice, groggy, irritated, as if I had woken him from something far more important. "I'm in the hospital," I said, my voice barely steady. "It's bad. Can you get Mom and Dad? Can you come?" There was a pause. Not the kind filled with concern, but the kind filled with inconvenience. "They're not here," he said finally. "We're in Vegas this weekend. Dad's got some golf thing. Mom's at a spa. I'm at the tables. For a moment the words didn't register. They felt disconnected from reality, like a sentence pulled from someone else's life. "You're all there?" I asked, my chest tightening not just from the illness but from something deeper, something harder to name. "Yeah," he replied as if it were obvious. "Everything's already paid for, flights, hotel. We can't just leave." I don't remember what I said after that. I don't remember if I said anything at all. I only remember the silence that followed, heavier than any noise, more suffocating than the illness itself. I ended the call without another word, staring at the ceiling as the reality settled in. I was alone. Not just physically, but completely. Hours later, the confirmation came not through a call, not through concern, but through a photo. My phone buzzed weakly against the hospital bed, and when I looked down there, it was my father, smiling broadly, a drink in his hand, standing on a sunlit golf course. Behind him, endless blue sky and the golden stretch of desert, the kind of image people post when they want the world to see how good life is. The caption read, "Enjoying life to the fullest." I stared at it for a long time, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with where I was. The contrast was almost surreal. While I lay hooked to machines fighting to stay alive, they were laughing under the sun, carefree, untouched by anything that mattered to me. That image did something to me. It cracked something open, something I had been holding together for far too long, but it was still not the worst of it. That came later in the form of a message that felt so deliberate, so precise in its cruelty, that it left no room for interpretation. My phone buzzed again, and I opened the text with hands that had begun to shake, not from the fever this time, but from something else entirely. "Maybe you'll finally become interesting when you die." There was no emoji, no hint of humor, no attempt to soften it. Just words. Cold, direct, intentional. For a second, the world seemed to narrow, as if everything around me, the monitors, the IV lines, the distant footsteps in the hallway, had faded into the background. All I could hear was that sentence repeating in my head with unbearable clarity. It wasn't just what he said, it was when he said it. While I was lying there unsure if I would make it through the night, he chose not just absence, not just indifference, but mockery. That was the moment everything broke. There were no more excuses left to make, no more narratives I could construct to protect them in my mind. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't poor timing or emotional distance. This was absolute betrayal, the kind that strips away every illusion in a single devastating instant. On one side there was me, fragile, terrified, clinging to life in a sterile room filled with machines. On the other side there was them, laughing, drinking, basking in the glow of a vacation that mattered more than my survival. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that it became impossible to ignore what it truly meant. For years I had told myself that family meant something unbreakable, that no matter how strained things became, there was a line they would never cross. But in that moment I realized that line had never existed for them, or if it had, they had stepped over it without hesitation. The message from my father wasn't just a cruel remark, it was a final confirmation, a nail driven firmly into the coffin of everything I had believed about us. Lying there with that sentence echoing in my mind, I felt something shift inside me. The fear didn't disappear, but it was no longer the strongest thing I felt. It was replaced by something clearer, colder, more resolute. A kind of understanding that cut through the confusion and left only truth behind. They had chosen their comfort over my life, their entertainment over my existence. And once you see something like that, once it's that clear, that undeniable, there's no going back to what you thought you had before. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with noise or drama, it came quietly, almost calmly, as if something inside me had finally settled after years of chaos. Lying in that hospital bed with my body still weak and my future uncertain, I realized that I had been living my life as if it belonged to someone else. Every decision, every paycheck, every ounce of energy had been shaped by the unspoken expectation that I existed to support them. And for the first time, I understood that nothing would change unless I did. They wouldn't suddenly become different people. They wouldn't wake up one day filled with gratitude or self-awareness. The only variable I could control was myself. And in that realization, something shifted, not just emotionally but fundamentally. I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. I decided. The next morning, when my fever had dropped just enough for my thoughts to sharpen, I reached for my phone, not to call them, not to explain or argue, but to act. My banking app opened with a familiar list of transactions, each one a quiet reminder of how deeply entangled my life had become with theirs. Automatic transfers to my parents' account for the mortgage, monthly payments covering utilities for a house I didn't live in, insurance policies in my name, credit cards I had opened for their emergencies that had long since become routine expenses. For years, this system had run in the background of my life, invisible but constant like a machine I had built and then forgotten how to turn off. Now I stared at it differently, not as support, not as obligation, but as something I had the power to stop. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of recognition. This was the line. Once I crossed it, there would be no going back to the version of myself who always said yes, who always absorbed the consequences of their choices. Then, slowly, deliberately, I began. I canceled the automatic mortgage payment first. The confirmation message appeared almost instantly, simple and final. Next, the insurance. Then the utilities. One by one, the connections unraveled. Each click severing a tie that had once felt permanent. There was no dramatic release, no sudden rush of emotion, just a steady, grounding sense of reclaiming something that had been taken from me piece by piece over the years. When I finished with the accounts, I moved on to something even more final. I called Elise, my financial advisor who had managed my investments for years. Her voice softened with concern when she heard I had been hospitalized, but I didn't let the conversation drift. "I need to make changes," I said. "Immediately. My parents and my brother are to be removed as beneficiaries from all accounts." There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone realizes the weight of what is being said. "Are you sure?" she asked carefully. And for the first time in my life, the answer came without doubt. Yes. Completely sure. Within minutes, the process was set in motion. The legal ties that once ensured they would always have access to what I built, now being rewritten to exclude them entirely. That wasn't the end of it. It couldn't be. Because what I was cutting off wasn't just financial, it was structural. Years ago, I had given them power over parts of my life I had assumed they would protect. So I called my lawyer next. Patrick had helped draft my will, had set up the legal frameworks I thought would keep everything secure if something ever happened to me. Back then, I had named them my parents as the ones who would make decisions on my behalf. Who would act in my best interest if I couldn't? Now that thought felt almost absurd. "I want to revoke the power of attorney," I told him. "All of it. And I need to rewrite my will." He didn't question me, didn't ask for justification. Perhaps he heard something in my voice that made explanation unnecessary. "Understood," he said simply. "I'll prepare everything." When I ended the call, I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, my body still fragile but my mind clearer than it had ever been. It was almost surreal how quickly everything could change. Years of dependency of carefully constructed support systems dismantled in a matter of hours. A few phone calls, a few confirmations, and just like that, the foundation they had relied on was gone, not out of revenge, not out of impulse, but out of necessity, because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was acting for myself. There was a strange sense of quiet that followed. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of control. For so long, my life had been filled with noise, the constant demands, the unspoken expectations, the pressure to always be available, always be enough. Now, sitting there with the faint hum of hospital equipment in the background, I realized that noise had never really been about urgency. It had been about access, and I had just taken that access away. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I could imagine the calls, the confusion, the anger that would inevitably follow, but for the first time, those thoughts didn't fill me with dread. They felt distant, almost irrelevant, because whatever came after this, it would no longer be shaped by obligation. It would no longer be dictated by fear of disappointing them or losing something that, in truth, had never really been there. This wasn't just a decision. It was a turning point the moment I stepped out of a role I had been forced into and reclaimed the right to define my own life. And as I closed my eyes, exhaustion finally pulling me under, there was one thought that stayed with me, steady and unshaken. I had spent years being their safety net. Now, for the first time, I was becoming my own. The backlash came faster than I expected and far more aggressively than I had prepared for. At first, it started with confusion, missed calls stacking up on my phone messages asking if there had been some kind of mistake. But confusion quickly turned into something else, something sharper and far more deliberate. The moment they realized the money was gone, that the safety net they had relied on for years had vanished overnight, the tone shifted completely. My father was the first to call. His voice, once casual and expectant, was now tight with barely controlled anger. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the hospital. Instead, he went straight to the point. "What did you do?" he demanded, as if I had violated some unspoken contract. When I didn't respond the way he wanted, when I refused to apologize or reverse anything, his frustration escalated into accusation. I was being unreasonable. I was overreacting. I was punishing them for no reason. It was as if my decision to stop giving had somehow become an attack on them. My mother's approach was different but no less calculated. Where my father used anger, she used emotion. Her messages came in long, carefully worded voicemails filled with trembling pauses and soft sobs, painting herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter. "We've always been there for you," she would say, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. "How can you do this to us? It wasn't a question, it was a performance. One designed to trigger guilt. To pull me back into the role I had played for so long." She didn't acknowledge what had happened in the hospital, didn't address the years of dependency or the hurt that had built up. Instead, she reframed the entire situation, positioning herself as the one who had been wronged, as if my boundaries were an act of cruelty rather than self-preservation. Then came Derek, who didn't bother with subtlety at all. His anger was loud, unfiltered, spilling over into accusations and insults that grew harsher with each message. "You think you're better than us now," he snapped in one call, his voice thick with resentment. "Sitting there with your money while we're struggling." The irony of his words didn't seem to register with him. For years, I had been the one carrying that struggle, absorbing it quietly so they wouldn't have to. Now that I had stepped away, he framed it as abandonment, as if I had suddenly withdrawn something they were entitled to, rather than something I had freely given for far too long. When anger didn't work, he shifted tactics, lashing out in ways that felt less like frustration and more like punishment. Threats, insults, attempts to provoke a reaction, anything that might force me back into engagement. But the most unsettling part wasn't the direct confrontation. It was what came next. When they realized they couldn't control me privately, they took it public. Derek was the first to make the move, posting a long emotional rant on social media about how his sister had abandoned her own family after finding success. He painted a picture of sacrifice and betrayal, carefully leaving out every detail that didn't support his narrative. To anyone reading it, I wasn't someone who had set boundaries after years of exploitation. I was a selfish daughter who had turned her back on the people who raised her. My mother followed in subtler ways, sharing vague, sorrowful posts about being hurt by those you love most, about loyalty and betrayal, allowing others to fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. My father remained quieter online, but his silence didn't mean absence. He reached out to extended family, to friends, to anyone who would listen, framing the story in a way that made them the victims and me the cause of their suffering. It was a coordinated effort, whether intentional or not. Different approaches, same goal: regain control. If guilt didn't work, then shame might. If private pressure failed, then public opinion could be weaponized. And for a moment, it almost worked. Messages began to come in from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Distant relatives, old family, friends, even acquaintances who felt entitled to comment on something they didn't understand. Some were cautious, asking if everything was okay. Others were more direct, questioning my choices, reminding me of my responsibilities, echoing the same narrative my family had created. It felt like being pulled into a version of reality I didn't recognize, one where my actions were stripped of context and rewritten to fit a story that painted me as the villain. But beneath all of it, there was something unmistakable. Not once did they acknowledge what they had done. Not once did they take responsibility for the years of dependence, the manipulation, or the moment that had pushed everything over the edge. There was no apology, no reflection, no sign of genuine remorse. Everything they said, everything they did revolved around what they had lost, not me, not the relationship, but the support, the access, the control. That was the clearest proof of all. This wasn't about repairing anything. It was about restoring a system that had benefited them for years. As the days went on, the pressure didn't ease, it intensified. Calls came at all hours, sometimes back-to-back, sometimes from unknown numbers that would hang up the moment I answered. Messages shifted from pleading to threatening, from emotional appeals to outright hostility. It became a kind of psychological siege, a constant attempt to wear me down, to exhaust me into compliance. But something inside me had changed. Where I once would have responded immediately eager to smooth things over, I now watched it unfold with a growing sense of distance. Not indifference, not entirely, but awareness. I could see the pattern for what it was, the strategy behind the chaos. This was no longer a family conflict. It was a battle over control, over identity, over the right to define my own life. And for the first time, I wasn't playing the role they had written for me. I wasn't defending myself against accusations that were never about truth in the first place. I wasn't stepping back into a system that had consumed me for years. Instead, I held my ground even as the noise around me grew louder, even as the pressure intensified. Because beneath the anger, the manipulation, the public shaming, there was a simple, undeniable reality. They weren't fighting to get me back. They were fighting to get back what I had taken away. And that was something I was no longer willing to give. By the time I realized that ignoring them was no longer enough, the situation had already crossed a line I could not afford to overlook. What had started as relentless calls and manipulative messages had escalated into something far more invasive: unwanted visits, public accusations, and a constant sense that no matter where I went, they would find a way to reach me. It wasn't just exhausting, it was destabilizing. My home no longer felt entirely safe. My phone had become a source of anxiety rather than connection, and even my workplace was no longer untouched by their presence. That was the moment I understood that boundaries, no matter how firm they felt internally, meant very little without something concrete to enforce them. I had taken back control of my finances and my life, but they were still trying to pull me back in, still testing the limits of what they could get away with. And I knew, with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, that I needed to take the next step. Calling my lawyer didn't feel dramatic or emotional. It felt necessary. Patrick listened quietly as I outlined everything: the messages, the social media posts, the attempts to contact me through other people, the incident at my office that had crossed from uncomfortable into unacceptable. I expected him to ask questions to weigh the situation carefully, but instead, he said something simple that stayed with me: "You have more than enough." What he meant was that this wasn't just a personal dispute anymore, it had become a legal matter. Harassment, defamation, repeated unwanted contact, these weren't just behaviors to tolerate or endure. They were violations. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see it that way, not as a family issue I was obligated to manage, but as something I had the right to stop. The process itself was surprisingly straightforward, almost clinical compared to the emotional chaos that had led me there. Documents were prepared, evidence, compiled screenshots of messages, records of calls, copies of posts that had attempted to damage my reputation. Each piece of proof felt like a fragment of a story I had lived through but never fully acknowledged until now. Seeing it all laid out in front of me, organized and undeniable, was both unsettling and validating. It stripped away any lingering doubt, any quiet voice that still questioned whether I was overreacting. I wasn't. If anything, I had tolerated far more than I should have. The day of the hearing arrived with a strange sense of calm. I expected nerves, fear, maybe even hesitation, but instead there was only focus. When they walked into the courtroom, dressed neatly, composed, almost rehearsed in their expressions, it struck me how easily appearances could be manipulated. To anyone who didn't know the full story, they might have seemed like a concerned family trying to resolve a misunderstanding, and they tried to play that role. My father spoke about miscommunication, my mother about emotional distress, Derek about how I had changed. They framed everything carefully, minimizing their actions, avoiding responsibility, turning the situation into something softer, more forgivable. But this time I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to defend myself with emotion or explanation. The evidence spoke clearly enough. The messages, the posts, the repeated attempts to contact me despite being told not to, all of it painted a picture that could not be softened or rewritten. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't revisit every detail or try to convince anyone of how I felt. I stated what had happened, what had continued to happen, and what I needed moving forward. Not reconciliation, not understanding, distance, protection, finality. The judge didn't hesitate. The restraining order was granted, effective immediately. No contact, no approaching within a specified distance, no indirect communication through others, no online posts referencing me. Clear, defined, enforceable boundaries, written not just as a request but as a legal reality. And in that moment, something shifted in a way that felt deeper than relief. It wasn't just that the harassment would stop or that I would no longer have to brace myself for the next message, the next call. the next attempt to pull me back in. It was that for the first time those boundaries were no longer dependent on my strength alone. They existed outside of me, supported by something solid, something that could not be argued with or ignored. Walking out of the courtroom, I expected to feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated. Instead, what I felt was quieter but far more powerful. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from ending something that should have ended long ago. They tried to speak to me as they were escorted out, their voices, calling my name, shifting once again between pleading and frustration. But for the first time, I didn't feel the pull to respond. There was no guilt, no instinct to fix. No lingering sense of responsibility. Just distance. Clean, absolute, and finally real. That order wasn't just a legal document. It was a line that could not be crossed, a boundary that no amount of manipulation or pressure could erase. It marked the end of something that had defined my life for years, and the beginning of something I was only just starting to understand, a life where I was no longer controlled, no longer obligated, no longer reduced to what I could give. For the first time, I wasn't just free in theory, I was free in reality. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full in a way I had never experienced before. For years, my life had been crowded with noise, constant demands, urgent messages, unspoken expectations that dictated how I spent my time, my energy, and even my sense of self. When that noise disappeared, it felt almost unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a space too wide, too still. But gradually, that stillness became something else. It became peace. Real peace, not the fragile kind that depends on everything going right, but the kind that exists when nothing is pulling you in directions you never chose. For the first time in years, I could wake up without bracing myself for what someone else might need from me. My mornings belonged to me. My thoughts belonged to me. And that simple shift changed everything. Physically, recovery was slow. My body needed time to rebuild after everything it had endured, and there were days when even small tasks felt heavier than they should. But emotionally, something had already begun to heal. Without the constant pressure of being responsible for everyone else, I had space to think, to feel, to understand who I was without the role I had carried for so long. I started noticing things I had ignored before, how tense I used to feel, checking my phone. How quickly I would say yes without thinking, how deeply I had tied my worth to being needed. Letting go of that wasn't instant, but it was steady. Each day I felt a little lighter, a little more grounded in something that wasn't defined by obligation. When the opportunity at Argent Solutions came, it felt almost surreal, as if it belonged to a different version of my life. The role was demanding, the expectations high, but for the first time the pressure felt meaningful. I wasn't working to patch someone else's problems, or to maintain a fragile balance at home. I was building something of my own. Leading a team, making decisions that mattered, being recognized for my skills rather than my sacrifices, it changed the way I saw myself. My work was no longer a means to support others at the cost of myself. It was a reflection of who I was capable of becoming. And with each project, each challenge I overcame, that sense of identity grew stronger. Outside of work, my life began to take shape in ways I had never allowed before. I moved into a new home, one that felt like mine, not just in name but in meaning. It wasn't tied to obligation or shared responsibility, it was a space I had chosen, built, and maintained for myself. There was a quiet satisfaction in that, in knowing that everything around me existed because I wanted it to, not because I was expected to provide it for someone else. Even small things like decorating a room, cooking a meal, or spending an evening in complete silence carried a sense of freedom I had never truly appreciated before. Then there were the relationships. For a long time I had associated closeness with responsibility, with the idea that caring for someone meant giving endlessly without question. But as I began to meet new people, to reconnect with parts of myself I had neglected, I realized how different healthy connections felt. They weren't built on pressure or obligation. They were mutual, balanced, grounded in respect rather than expectation. When I met Daniel, that difference became even clearer. From the beginning, there was no need to prove anything, no unspoken demand to give more than I had. He listened without judgment, remembered the small details that mattered to me, and perhaps most importantly, respected the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. Being with him didn't feel like another role to fulfill, it felt like a choice, one I could make freely every day. Looking back, the contrast between my past and present was almost impossible to ignore. Where there had once been constant tension, there was now calm. Where there had been chaos and unpredictability, there was stability. And where I had once measured my worth by how much I could endure or provide, I now measured it by something far simpler: how aligned my life felt with who I truly was. That didn't mean everything was perfect. There were still moments of doubt, occasional echoes of the guilt I had carried for so long. But those moments no longer controlled me. They passed, replaced by a deeper understanding of what I had gained by letting go. Healing, I realized, wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't shaped me. It was about learning to exist beyond it, about building something new without being defined by what had been taken from me. And in that process, I discovered something I hadn't expected: not just relief, not just freedom, but a quiet, steady confidence in my ability to stand on my own, to choose who I let into my life, to create something meaningful without sacrificing myself in the process. For the first time, my life wasn't a reaction to someone else's needs. It was something I was actively creating piece by piece with intention and clarity. And in that, there was a kind of fulfillment no amount of external approval or obligation could ever provide. For a long time, I thought revenge meant balance, that somehow the pain I had endured needed to be returned in equal measure, that justice required them to feel what I had felt. But as my life grew quieter, steadier, and more my own, that belief began to fade. I realized that nothing I could do to them would ever truly restore what had been taken from me, and more importantly, I no longer needed it to. The real shift came when I stopped measuring my healing by their suffering and started measuring it by my own peace. While they struggled with the consequences of their choices, fractured relationships, instability, and the loss of the one person who had held everything together, I was building something entirely different. Not out of spite, not to prove a point, but because I finally understood that my life didn't need to revolve around them at all. There was a quiet power in that realization. Letting go wasn't weakness and it wasn't avoidance, it was clarity. It meant choosing not to carry the weight of their actions any longer, not to let their behavior define the direction of my life. For years, I had confused endurance with strength, believing that staying, giving, and sacrificing were signs of love. But true strength, I learned, was knowing when to walk away and having the courage to do so without looking back. The absence of toxic people in my life didn't leave a void. It created space for growth, for genuine connection, for a version of myself that had been buried under obligation for far too long. In the end, the idea of revenge became irrelevant. I didn't need to hurt them to heal myself. Living well, fully, freely, and without the constant pull of dysfunction became its own kind of resolution. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was lasting, and that more than anything felt like justice.